cost of living dollar bills. You only got
Folk music during this time is all about acoustic instruments and the human voice. No electric guitar, no loud instruments like drums, no electric bass, no keyboard, none of that. Folk music prides itself on its simplicity and its honesty and being humble, and playing these quiet instruments that produce their own sound on their own is part of the folk movement, and they really reject electric instruments. Now, it's not just because electric instruments are so new in the mid 60s, even back in the 1950s, before rock and roll, we had Chicago electric blues, and many folk enthusiasts love that kind of music, but they still think that electric instruments don't have any place in folk music, specifically because it's considered too commercial. And if you use electric instruments, they'll say that you're a sellout, that you are doing whatever it takes to get rich in this industry. The exact same criticism we heard in the London blues scene by musicians like Eric Clapton of the Yardbirds and later Cream, as well as Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. Well, Bob Dylan is nothing if not a trailblazer. And Bob Dylan hears this music of the Beatles, and he actually really enjoys it. And if you remember, I mentioned during our lecture on the Beatles that they met with Bob Dylan in fall of 1964, and he really enjoyed their music. But what Bob Dylan said to them, and this is right about the time of the first Newport Folk Festival, you have this incredible platform. Millions and millions of people are listening to your music. I think you should say something with a little bit more substance, because at the time they were just doing love songs. Almost all their songs were love songs. And Bob Dylan's the one who encourages them to write something more personal. And then we get songs like Help and A Hard Day's Night, I'm a Loser, Tomorrow Never Knows. So the Beatles become more like Bob Dylan in that way. Similarly, Bob Dylan becomes more like the Beatles in that he starts to incorporate these electric instruments. Bob Dylan, a folk artist, is essentially about to release a rock album. Now, he still considers it folk. Thematically, it's still about the same ideas as folk. It's still him singing and playing guitar, but he got rid of the acoustic guitar and picked up an electric guitar. He added an electric bass player, he added a drummer, he added a keyboard player. It's folk music being played in the rock style. Well, despite this stigma in the folk music community, Bob Dylan moves forward and releases his first electric album called Bringing It All Back Home. And in reality, only about half of the songs on this album feature electric instruments. The other half are just the standard acoustic instruments that we would hear in folk music from any other artist. The biggest hit off of this album is one of the electric songs, and it's called Subterranean Homesick Blues. This was in 1965, and it's a big hit. As you can see here, this song even has a music video from 1965 in which Bob Dylan holds up posters with words from the song. As you may have guessed, people in the folk community are outraged by this sound, but Bob Dylan decides he's going to take this new sound one step further and premiere his new electric band at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. So just a year earlier, he had tremendous success as a traditional folk artist. Now he's coming back, but he's bringing a rock band with him. It goes terribly. His performance is fine. He has a great performance, but the crowd just absolutely hates it. When he shows up with his band, the crowd starts booing. Pete Seeger, if you remember Pete Seeger, who wrote Little Boxes, it was one of those artists from the first generation of folk music. The story is that he's there and he's running around with his hands covering his ears. He can't stop the sound, so he goes in his car and he rolls the windows up. That still doesn't stop the sound, so finally he just tries to run up to the stage and unplug all their amplifiers, but he can't get past the security guards. Now that's a story that goes around. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's a bit of folklore attached to Bob Dylan's shift to electric music at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. Dylan goes electric. That's what it gets to be known as. So now whenever any artist who's known for their acoustic music decides to use some electric instruments, the joke is that you just say it's their last name, goes electric. Well, if we think back to some other initially controversial artists like Elvis, at first when he had the provocative dance moves, some people loved his music and others rejected it. But as soon as he made it more mainstream, he toned down some of the more provocative elements. Then he really increased his audience. Same thing with the Beatles. Initially, they had on leather jackets and slick back hair, but Brian Epstein put them in suits and made them a little bit more presentable, and sure enough, they got this huge audience. Well, the same thing happens with Bob Dylan, but it's a little bit different in that he wasn't enjoying mainstream success because he was playing this folk music, which was a small genre. But now that he's going electric, now that he has this rock sound, he gains so many more fans. So he loses some of his core base, but his fan base in total grows exponentially. Bob Dylan has a man by the name of Al Kooper playing the Hammond organ. Now, Al Kooper was a guitar player, and he hoped that he would get to play guitar. However, another guitar player by the name of Michael Bloomfield. Michael Bloomfield was a really well-established professional guitar player. He was already playing, but Al Kooper still wants to play. So as the band's rehearsing and as they're in the recording studio getting ready, he just starts playing this Hammond organ part, plucking it out. He's a guitar player, he's not a pianist, he's not an organ player, so he's not playing any virtuosic material. He's just sort of plucking out this nice little melody. And Bob Dylan loves it. It sounds very amateurish, but Bob Dylan thinks it sounds great. The record producer tells Al Kooper to stop playing, he's messing with the sound, and Bob Dylan says, "No way, I love it, keep it on there." And that sound, that Hammond organ, as played in a very simple way by Al Kooper, goes on to be an important aspect of Bob Dylan's electric sound. Other musicians in other bands start trying to imitate that. So that's like if you didn't really play, let's say, the saxophone, but you picked it up just to have fun, start playing the saxophone, and what you play, even though you don't really know how to play this instrument, it sounds so cool that you get to be on a record, and then all these other bands start trying to play an instrument the way you play it, even though you don't really know how to play it very well. That's what happens. So all these other folk bands start including Hammond organ on their records in a very simple style similar to Al Kooper. Well, once Dylan goes electric, he becomes a megastar in his own right. He has 2 successful follow-up albums, but then he's involved in a motorcycle accident. Bob Dylan, he's hurt, he's banged up, but he's going to be okay. But he withdraws from the music industry. This is the mid-60s, he's at the height of his popularity, and he withdraws. So we've seen this a few times. Elvis, at the height of his career up to that point, enlisted in the army. The Beatles, at the height of their popularity, decided that they would only write and record new music to release on albums, but not actually go out and play the music live. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys did the same thing. He retired from performing to stay home and write and record. Now Bob Dylan, at the height of fame, decides he's going to withdraw from the music industry altogether. We're not going to hear anything from Bob Dylan for a few years. But through his music, through going electric, he has already inspired so many other musicians. Some of them were folk musicians and others were rock musicians, but now they want to play this electric Bob Dylan style, which will come to be known as folk rock, the topic of our next video lecture.